Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. We are often asked the reason as to why Islam or the last messenger of God was sent in Arabia. Why not to another place or region? Furthermore, every time we are looking at Islamic history, we often recall pre-Islamic period as a point of reference. What was this period like? Why was it called Jahiliya, the time of ignorance? In this lecture, we want to take a cursory look at the pre-Islamic Arabian era from social, religious, political, economic, and cultural aspects, so that when we refer to it in other lectures, we have a good understanding of this period. According to Britannica, the very name Arabia, or its Arabic name Jaziratul Arab, has come to be used for the whole peninsula. But the definition of area, even in Islamic sources, is not agreed upon unanimously. In its narrowest application, it indicates much less than the whole peninsula, while in ancient Greek and Latin sources, and often in subsequent sources, the term Arabia includes the Syrian and Jordanian deserts and the Iraqi desert west of the lower Euphrates. Similarly, Arabs represented, at least in pre-Islamic times, mainly the tribal populations of central and northern Arabia. So, roughly speaking, we're talking about a region bounded by Asham, or today's Syria and Jordan in the north, part of Yemen in the south, Red Sea in the west, Iraq and Persian Gulf in the east. Arab tribes began to appear in the South Syrian deserts and southern Jordan around 200 CE, but spread from the Central Arabian Peninsula after the rise of Islam in the 630 CE. In the south, where Yemen is located, there was a great civilization in Saba area where the Quran refers to their queen who had a wise reign over the region, as some call her Bilqis, Queen of Sheba. They had, for example, devised a large water reservoir system because of which the city had become green and full of vegetation. According to the Quran in chapter 34, called Saba, there was for the tribe of Saba in their dwelling place a sign, 2 fields of gardens on the right and on the left. They were told, eat from provisions of your Lord and be grateful to him. A good land have you and a forgiving Lord. According to Britannica, from the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, a farming civilization developed in Yemen in the oasis along the edge of the desert. The people of this civilization had gradually mastered techniques enabling them to accumulate water from seasonal mountain rivers and distribute it into extensive irrigation systems. Relevant inscriptions were discovered at the end of the 8th century. On the northern side, around Hijaz, however, there was the dry desert and hence infertile and not much vegetation. Even Ibrahim alayhi salam says in the Quran in chapter 14, رَبَّنَا إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عِنْدَ بَيْتِ الْمُحَرَّمِ. Our Lord, I have settled some of my descendants in an uncultivated valley near your sacred house. So the area is described in the Quran as an uncultivated valley in the desert. And because it had never been conquered or even considered by neighboring civilizations such as Persia and Rome, no foreign culture entered this forgotten land. So no chance of cultural and educational growth from its primitive desert culture. The most remarkable feature of Arabian life before Islam was the total absence of political organization in any form. With the exception of Yemen in the southwest, no part of Arabian Peninsula had any government at any time, and the Arabs never acknowledged any authority other than their tribe's chief authority. The modern students of history find it incredible that the Arabs lived generation after generation, century after century, without a government of any kind. Since there was no government, there was no law and order. In the event a crime was committed, the injured party took the law in his own hands and administered justice to the offender. This system led very frequently to acts of horrendous cruelty and often beyond equal retribution. Since there were no such a thing as courts or judges, the only protection a man could find from his enemies was in his own tribe. The tribe had an obligation to protect its members even if they had committed crimes. Tribalism took precedence over ethics. In the absence of any government, there was anarchy. Hence, tribes were often engaged in endless warfare, which was a permanent institution of the Arabian society. War gave them an opportunity to display their skills at archery, fencing, and horsemanship. And also in war, they could distinguish themselves by their heroism and at the same time win glory and honor for their tribes. According to the historian Herbert J. Mueller, the population of Arabia consisted of two main divisions, sedentary and nomadic. Hijaz and South Arabia were dotted with many small and a few large towns. The rest of the country had a floating population composed of Bedouins who were backward in the civil and political sense, but they were also a source of anxiety and fear for the sedentary population. They lived as pirates of the desert, and they were notorious for their unrestrained individualism. Mueller adds, quote, Arabs were notorious for certain characteristics such as arrogance, conceit, boastfulness, vindictiveness, and excessive love of plunder. Their arrogance was partly responsible for their failure to establish a state of their own. They lacked political discipline, and until the rise of Islam, never acknowledged any authority as paramount in Arabia. They acknowledged the authority of a man who led them into a war, but he could command their obedience only if they had an assurance of receiving a fair share of the spoils of the war, and his authority lapsed as soon as the expedition was over, unquote. The region was torn into hostile tribes, often engaged in vindictive fighting amongst each other over trivial matters. Their economy was based on trade. They traded material and managed caravans passing through the major cities like Mecca. Caravan trade was essential to the economy of Mecca, and its organization called for considerable skill, experience, and ability. The most important urban centers of Arabia were Mecca and Yathrib, Medina, in Hijaz. The citizens of Mecca were mostly merchants and moneylenders. Their caravans traveled in summer to Syria and in winter to Yemen. Slavery was an economic institution of the Arabs. Male and female slaves were sold and bought like animals, and they formed the most depressed class of the Arabian society. The most powerful class were the capitalists and moneylenders. Usury was rampant, and the interest rates they charged on loans were outrageous, specially designed to make the rich richer and the borrowers poorer. Socially, family groups called clans formed larger tribal units which reinforced family cooperation in the difficult living conditions on the peninsula and protected its members against other tribes. Tribes provided a means of protection for their members. Death to one clan member meant brutal retaliation. Non-members of the tribes were, of course, viewed as outsiders or enemies. Tribes shared common ethical understandings and provided the individual with an identity. Warfare between tribes was common and given high honor among the Bedouins. The difficult living conditions in the Arabian Peninsula created a heavy emphasis on family cooperation, further strengthening their clan system. The Bedouin tribes relied on their herds of goats, sheep, and camels for meat, milk, cheese, blood, wool, and other provisions. They also hunted, served as bodyguards, escorted caravans, worked as mercenaries, and traded or raided to gain animals, women, gold, fabric, and other luxury items. From the education perspective, among the Arabs, there were very few individuals who could read and write. Most were not very eager to learn, and some historians are of the opinion that the culture of this period was almost entirely oral. The Jews and the Christians were the custodians of such knowledge. As such, the greatest intellectual accomplishment of the pagan Arabs was their poetry, as they placed heavy importance on it, and oral traditions as a means of communication. Poetry was also used to communicate through songs, anthems, and sometimes promoted tribal propaganda. Tribes constructed verses against their enemies, often discrediting their people or fighting abilities. This is why the Quran emphasizes it is not word of a poet. وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ شَاعِرٍ. From religious perspective, even those who lived in the cities believed in myths and superstitions. Before the rise of the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, most Bedouin tribes practiced polytheism in the form of idolatry. There were pockets of atheists also who believed that the world was eternal, Manichaeans who were influenced by the Persian doctrine of dualism in nature. They believed that there were two gods representing the twin forces of good and evil, or light and darkness, and both were locked up in an unending struggle for supremacy. There were also those who worshipped stars. Then Judaism and Christianity appeared as few tribes in Medina and northern part of Arabia. Of course, later followed by Islam, which spread throughout the whole region. Despite the later penetration of Judaism and Christianity, the peninsula was never controlled by any foreign power. Arabia had a strategic location between Mesopotamia and Egypt, or between India and Africa. However, the harsh climate, the lack of significant water supply, and the fierce independence of its inhabitants made it undesirable to conquer. Most Bedouin tribes practiced polytheism, often in the form of animism. Animists believed that non-human entities, animals, plants, and inanimate objects or phenomena possess a spiritual essence. Totemism and idolatry, or worship of totems or idols representing natural phenomena, were also common religious practices in the pre-Islamic world. Idols were housed in Kaaba, the ancient sanctuary in the city of Mecca, which attracted worshippers from all over Arabia. They also believed in jinn and shayateen, whom they named parts of desert after them for protection when they traveled through them. They believed God, the Creator, had daughters from jinn, but wanted sons as offsprings for themselves. As the Quran points out, وَجَعَلُوا بَيْنَهُ وَبَيْنَ الْجِنَّةِ نَسَبًا. And they asserted kinship between him, Allah, and the jinn. They filled Kaaba with over 360 idols, which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had to clear out as he conquered Mecca and recited from the Quran, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. And say, truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood will certainly vanish. They considered their main idols feminine, as they called them with feminine names like Allat, Al-Uzzat, Mannat, which is feminine for Mannan, and so on, which were all deities they worshipped. Allat was the goddess associated with the underworld. Al-Uzzat, the mighty one, or the strong, was a fertility goddess, and she was called upon for protection and victory before war. Mannat was the goddess of fate. The Book of Idols describes her as the most ancient of all idols. The Quran rejects this as blasphemy, as it says, "To Allah belongs the finest names, attributes. So call him by them and keep away from those who blaspheme his names." They perverted the divine names and meanings. Their anthems and songs as they made tawaf included glorifying their idols, saying Allah, Al-Uzzat, and Manat are high like flying birds whose intercession are source of hope. They shouted the same anthem trying to disrupt Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as he recited these verses in chapter 53 that say, so have you considered Allah and Al-Uzzat and Manat the third, the other one? Is the male for you and female for him, means Allah. That then is an unjust division. Then goes on the verses, they're not but mere names you have named them and your forefathers, for which Allah has sent down no authority. They follow noting and assumptions, and they're following their desires. Historical traditions have been transmitted by early Muslim analysts and geographers. More data on the ancient folklore and religion appear in the Book of the Idols, Kitab al-Asnam by Ibn Kalbi, and in The Crown by Al-Hamdani, which you can refer for more details on the idols. Back to religious practices. When they made an offering to sacrifice for them, like if my camel has 10 calves, I will offer the 10th as sacrifice to those idols. They would wipe the idols with blood of the sacrifice and make tawaf seeking blessing from them. The most common offerings were animals, crops, food, liquids, milk, and wine. Camel herding Arabs would devote certain of their animals to idols, excluding them from being worked by men and allowing them to die a natural death. The Quran in chapter 5 gives a number of examples, such as the female camel that is the last in a series of females born by one mother, Bahira, and a she camel that has lived to see her offsprings bear offspring, Saiba. Their ears would be slit to indicate they were in a state of prohibition and they would be left to graze without a herdsman. From cultural perspective, they had many strange customs. They used to tie certain amulets and short ropes to their horses, which they believed would protect them. They used to engage in perverted sexual relationships, while they treated women as possession, not human beings. Women were inherited, owned, and exchanged or sold. Under the customary tribal law in pre-Islamic Arabia, a woman had virtually no legal status. Tribal law determined women's rights. Fathers sold their daughters into marriage for a price, or the husbands could terminate the union at will. And women had little or no property or succession rights. One of the most important roles for women was to bear children, especially male offspring. Women also cooked meals, milked animals, washed clothes, prepared butter and cheese, spun wool, and knitted fabric for tents. The second role for some women was that of an entertainer and singer at men's wine feasts. In very few instances, upper-class women in cities had more rights than tribal women and might own property or even inherit from relatives. In general population, though, inheritance was passed through the male lines. Women could not inherit property. The tribal leader enforced the tribe's spoken rules, which generally limited the rights of women. Women were often considered as property to be inherited or seized in a tribal conflict. When a man died and left a widow, his heir, his son, if he came at once and threw his garment over her, had the right to marry her under the dowry of her deceased master, or to give her in marriage and take her dowry. A variety of marriage customs were also common, such as temporary marriage, polygyny, one man with many wives, and polyandry, one woman with many husbands. The relations of the sexes were extremely loose. Many women sold sex to make their living, since there was little else they could do. These women flew flags on their houses and were called ladies of the flags. There were also patterns of homicidal abuse of women and girls, including instances of killing female infants, as the Quran reports in chapter 16 and says, "And when one of them is informed of the birth of female, his face becomes dark and he suppresses grief. He hides himself from people because of the ill of that which he has been informed. Should he keep it in humiliation or bury it in the ground? Unquestionably, evil is what they decide." And then the Quran condemns it as a grave sin. "And do not kill your children for fear of poverty. We provide for them and for you. Indeed, their killing is ever a great sin." The motives were twofold: the fear of financial burden, of course, and the and then the fear of the humiliation frequently caused when the girls were captured by a hostile tribe and subsequently preferring their captors to their parents and brothers. Slavery, compulsive drinking, and gambling were part of the social norms, and they regarded many immoral acts as noble acts. And many evil customs, such as kidnapping, infanticide, and wasting away their strength in taking revenge, were prevalent among them, among the prevalent customs among them. It is to such an idolatrous, uneducated, and backward people whom Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was sent to guide, to educate, to make peace, to propagate Islam, to abolish wrong practices, and finally unite them as a nation, which would later become one of the greatest civilizations in human history. Islam took them out of ignorance, where no society on earth recognized them, to a nation rivaling the great civilizations of that time. As such, Islam was propagated through this newly educated and invigorated nation to other nations of the world. Iman transformed them from ignorance to knowledge and education, from violence to warmth, friendship and sacrifice, from superstitions to rational thinking, and from polytheism to monotheism. First in Arabia, followed by other nations. It is as if you have a group of people in need of water and you have a glass of water in hand. Naturally, you start with the person who is the thirstiest of them all. While the neighboring civilizations were in need of such revelation and guidance, the Arabs of Jahiliya were in need of it the first and foremost. A transformation which is nothing short of miracle. When earlier prophets performed miracles by the will of God, those miracles were instantaneous, and they mean to prove their prophethood. The transformation of the Arab society carried out by Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, inspired by the Quran, was the proof of his prophethood and leadership. As the Quran declares, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. It is he who has sent among the uneducated a messenger from themselves, reciting to them his verses and purifying them and teaching them the book and wisdom, although they were in clear error before. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.